So for the last 2 weeks, I have been on holidays and it's been wonderful. I've been travelling the countryside of New South Wales and Victoria, which is absolutely beautiful. I've been learning how to relax again, how not to check my phone every single minute. I get a little email coming in. And it's interesting, when you get to this place of relaxation, just how funny everybody else looks, particularly in Melbourne. Everyone's like running, not because it's Melbourne, but just, that was the first time we met lots more people. But everyone's like really busy and they're all hurrying around, they're looking stressed and frazzled. I'm like, what's there to be stressed about? It's a beautiful day, I'm here, eating lots of food, people are serving me, it's great. I love this holiday business. Every time I travel, this is something I often forget, is how small I am. But this is a good thing actually for me to remember, because as I see everybody else hurrying about working or working as they're serving me as a tourist, I'm reminded, like, why am I so worried about my life? Like, we're all busy doing all this stuff, but we're part of something so much bigger. And sometimes you just get so consumed in your little life that going away on holidays or having a change of scenery reminds you that actually maybe we're not as important as we think we are, and maybe the work that we do isn't as important as we think it is. One of the questions I have, and this is a question that I'm sure you've heard me ask before because it's something I've really wrestled with since I was a teenager, and it came up again when I was on holidays, is what is it all for? All this busyness, all this work that we do, what is it all for? Can we speak about having meaning or purpose in our lives? Now, I've realized over time that most people don't ask that question. Most people just, get on and live and do stuff. And they're like, why are you asking that question? But maybe you've asked, I think a question that sits under my question, and it goes something like this. Maybe you've asked, what job should I do? What subject should I choose for my HSC? Should I go to uni? What uni? What should I study at uni? Once I finish my first degree, should I study another degree? Should I change careers? Should I learn a new skill? Christians might add like a Christian element to it. So we might say, what is God calling me to do? What purpose does God have for me? What door is He going to open? Should I use my gifts? And should that be used for my job, or is that outside of my job? Have you guys ever asked any of those questions? Maybe sometimes. So I think they're really important questions to ask. And I want to spend some time this term looking at work, because we spend the majority of our lives working. And by work, I also mean study. So by the time you're like 5, basically you're starting to work and study and learn. And it's kind of what we defines us. The first thing you kind of ask someone after their name is, what do you do? And you're like, okay, that's what you do, interesting. Or what school do you go to? We make judgment calls on that. So we're working and we're busy and we're hurrying along, but often I don't think we have space to think about, what does it all mean? And what might God have to say it? If we're Christians, and I'm assuming that a lot of us here are Christians, if we're people who believe that there is a God, if we're people who've entrusted our lives to Jesus Christ, then it's really important that we ask God, what do you think about work? And how does your views shape the decisions I'm going to make about my work? So that's what we're going to do this term. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of work, I'm going to spend some time thinking about the first question. What is it all for? Is there such a thing as meaning or purpose in our lives? Because until we get that question, I think, sorted out, the second question is harder to answer. And I think the first question will help us answer the second question. Okay, so you with me? Okay, so we're going to be looking at Genesis. Genesis 1, I think, is foundational in answering this question, or Genesis 1 and 2. Now, when Genesis was created, it was written in a culture that gave a very different answer. And I want to give you an example. So in Mesopotamia, if you ask people, is there such a thing as a purpose or meaning for human life? I think they would have struggled to answer that question. Because their religion was, well, one, there's lots of gods. And these gods are really interesting and really important, far more interesting and important than you little human beings. And in fact, one god, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, Marduk. He destroys lots of other old gods. He likes battling and fighting gods. Anyway, once he's done that, he's like, to establish his order, he conceives of this brilliant idea so that the gods won't have to do much work. He's like, I know, we'll create an underclass of slaves that can do the work for us. And guess who they are? You guys, well, not you exactly, the Babylonians or the Mesopotamians. So the idea of human beings were slaves to do work so the gods could relax and rest, whatever gods do when they're not working. And this myth then shapes the way that you view people. I mean, people are viewed as dispensable, not worth much, particularly peasants. You know, they do some work, then they die, we get more peasants in. And it's kind of a low view. So the idea of people having a purpose, it's not a question that was really asked. So that's when Genesis was written. That was the type of culture that we're talking about. If we think about our own context today, how would people answer the question, is there a purpose or meaning in life? I think a lot of people would say, that's a foolish question. That's a question that can't be answered because, I mean, there's no God. And if there's no God, then the idea of there being ultimate purpose is redundant. There is no ultimate purpose. All there is this life. You just are until you're not. And so the best, I guess, you can hope for is that you work out what brings you satisfaction and you work out what brings you purpose, and then you do that, have fun, hopefully, and then you die. But there's a part of us that I think is unsatisfied by that. And you see glimpses of it every now and then. I don't think many of you would have watched this TV show because it's on the ABC. But it's a new TV show called Humans. I think I'm getting old. I'm watching a lot of stuff on the ABC now. But it's a TV show called Humans. So it's this classic sci-fi story. Humans, a little bit into our future, are able to create robots that look like humans, except they're like beautiful and perfect. And they do all the jobs that we hate. So the robots come in and they do the domestic jobs. They're the cleaners in your high schools. The nurses looking after elderly people. They're prostitutes. And, I mean, it sounds like a good idea. They do all the jobs that we don't want to do, so then, you know, we can focus on the really interesting jobs. Except there's starting to be some faults. Now, there's the classic, you know, robots are getting self-aware, so they're like, hang on, we don't like being slaves, and we're smarter than you, so they're going to rebel, I think. But there's also this really interesting character, a teenager. And she's pretty smart, but she's starting not to go well at school. And she says, you know, what's the point of studying? Because say if she wants to be a doctor, and it takes 7 years to be a doctor, they'll be able to make a robot that in 7 seconds will be able to have all the knowledge that is required for that robot to be a doctor, and that robot's going to do a far better job than me. So she says, what's the point of studying and trying to pursue work, because there's going to be no work for me to do. And she even says, you know, what does it mean to be human if you can't work? I actually thought, you know, it's a really interesting question, like she's wrestling with, or this TV show is wrestling with, what does it mean to be human? And work is seen as such a central part of that. And I thought that question can only be asked because of Genesis, because the Bible has shaped Western culture. The idea of individuals, apart from, you know, the kings, but the idea of any individual having a purpose is an idea I think has been shaped by the Bible. So let's look at this Genesis passage, Genesis 1, verse 27. So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Genesis gives a radically different idea as to why human beings exist. It says, no, you don't exist because some gods decided we needed some more slaves. And you are not just this random blip of life in a universe that doesn't care. It says human beings exist because God created them. One God created them for a purpose. And he made them in the image of God. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? If you ever asked that question, you're along with lots of other people. Across the centuries, people have speculated and come up with different ideas. They've said, okay, to be made in the image of God, it's our reason, it's our ability to think. That's what sets us apart, and that's what helps us show God. And other people have said, no, it's our ability to be creative, to create, to innovate. That's what shows that we are made in the image of God. Other people are like, no. It's our ability to be in relationships, our ability to love others, maybe God. That's what makes us different. I think all those explanations have some truth to it, but I'm going to suggest a fourth alternative, and you can disagree with me later or not. I think it says we are made in the image of God, or in other words, we are image bearers, which means we are made to be God's representatives on this earth, making God visible to creation in how we live. This is a really radical idea. And it's an idea, it might not seem so radical now, but it's an idea we can lose, because it says all human beings are representatives of God, that in every human being we catch a glimpse of who God is. And if that's true, then that means every human being is precious. Now, this is a radical idea in the ancient Near East culture, because the person maybe who might be made in the image of God would be the king, maybe the priests. But to say that every human being is, that's radical, because that changes who's important. And it does get watered down, then we forget about it, we need to remind it again, because sometimes we think certain races are more important than others, or we think certain genders are more important. But actually Genesis says male and female, all ethnic groups, no matter how rich you are or how smart you are, in God's eyes we're all the same. We are all equal, and we are all like rulers, representatives, kings and queens of God. Very powerful idea. Because when you think about the Mesopotamian culture, basically humans were very passive. They're just kind of, it's almost like they're watching a football game on their couch, watching a TV game, and they're just cheering on the gods. That's their main role. Just cheer on the gods, help them, be their slaves. But God turns it upside down and says, actually, I'm inviting you to play on the field. Come and join me and help me in shaping this world. Help me in ruling this world. Now, Genesis assumes that happens in relationship. To be a representative of God kind of assumes you're going to have some type of relationship with God. So we were made to be in relationship with God. And out of that relationship then stems everything else. And we see a glimpse, a really small taste of what that relationship might be like just as it's about to be destroyed in Genesis 3. You see God, and it's described as God walking in the garden, getting ready to have a chat with Adam, and it's all about to tumble down. But that's the type of relationship we're meant to have, one where God abides with us and we with him. And then in that relationship, which is one of deep love and awe, then extends out into how we relate to the rest of the world and with one another. There's a second creation account in Genesis 2. And in Genesis 2, for the first time, God notes that something is not good. And so he says this, Genesis 2, verse 18. Yahweh, God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him." Now this emphasizes what was said earlier in Genesis 1, but just kind of brings it more into focus. One person doesn't fully represent God. It is a whole human community in the end, but it's male and female complementing one another that we begin to see more of who God is. And as we interact with one another in love, whether that's in marriage or in our families or in our communities or in our friendships, we show who God is, and we declare that God is a social being, that God at his very core is relational, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we are called to be relational too. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with work? Well, sometimes when we think about work, it depends if you're a workaholic or not, you can start to think, my whole purpose is what I do with my job, what I get paid for, that defines me. I want to remind you, though, that our purpose is bigger than whatever job we do, that our purpose is deeply embedded in the relationships that God placed us into. So we need to think about, what does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean to be a husband or a wife or a mother or a father or an aunt or a friend? I think I said that. Colleague, a neighbor. Wherever I am, whether it's in school or at work or in my family, that's part of my purpose. And I can't let work overtake that. So how does it look like to reflect God in my relationships wherever I am? Genesis continues with a command, 1:28. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." In some ways, this is a really strange command because it's kind of stating the obvious. God says, make sure you go and have sex and have lots of children. Like, do we need to be told that? It's like if God commanded us, if you want to survive, I command you, breathe in, breathe out. Like, do we need to be commanded? Or it's like, I don't know, do you like chocolate? Or think of something that you like to eat. It's like if God said, when you eat this piece of chocolate, I command you to enjoy it. Like, it's a really obvious command that God gives here. And so you think, why does God need to tell us that? And out of all the commands that God has given us, I think this is the one we can successfully tick off as having done. Like 6 billion people on this planet, we have successfully multiplied and filled the earth. Why does God give us this command? Firstly, I think it's a blessing. He is blessing humanity to multiply and fill the earth. But secondly, so yes, don't feel like I'm telling you must all go out and have lots of children right now, because we've done a pretty good job at subduing the earth, or filling the earth anyway. But I think he says have lots of kids in context of the second part of the line. So he says, I want you to subdue the earth. Now, actually, that's a command, and it's quite a strong word he uses. Go out and subdue the earth. Part of the way you're going to do that is by having lots of you, so then you can do it all together. But why does he say subdue? One of the things that frustrates me sometimes when people talk about Genesis 1 and 2 is they go, in the beginning, the world was perfect. It was without sin, unblemished, like perfect. That's not what Genesis says. What does Genesis say the world was in the beginning? Good. Yeah, that was the first bit. But once the earth is created, it says it was good, very, very good sometimes. But God never says that the world is perfect or excellent. He says it's good. And if it was perfect, humans wouldn't have anything to do. But actually, God gives humans a purpose. And he says, go out into this earth, which is good, has all this potential. But it's also wild. And it's also a little bit dangerous. I want you to go out and do something with it. And what does that look like? What might that look like? Well, he gives us an example. So he gives us Eden. So let's look at Eden, chapter 2, verse 8. Now Yahweh God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. Yahweh God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Eden is a sanctuary, but it also gives us a taste of what it looks like to subdue the world. So God gives us an example and says, I want you to spread out and to continue this work. And he actually tells Adam to, go and garden, till, look after the land. That is your job. It wasn't just, so when you picture Adam and Eve, it wasn't just that they were on holidays 24/7, strolling around, smelling the roses, waiting for a piece of fruit to fall down so they could eat it, sunbathing or sleeping the day away, then going out and having a water fight. Now, they might have done all that stuff, and some of that stuff is good, and God thankfully also calls us to relax and to have fun. But Genesis suggests that that's not enough. Actually, we are called to cultivate, to create places that flourish, that create spaces where relationships can flourish, where people can meet and worship God. And when we don't do that, and we are capable of doing it, then in some ways we're subhumans. In some ways we're missing our full potential of what God calls us to do and be. To be human is to work. Sometimes it might not feel like that. Sometimes you might think, oh no, surely work was just part of the sin and the fall. Actually, no, work is good. And we are called to cultivate and partner with God in doing something for this world. And slowly, the picture was that Eden would spread right across the world and all of creation would praise God. So that's the first half of the command, which we might be uncomfortable with or might not be uncomfortable with. But the second part of the command, I think we are very uncomfortable with today. It goes like this. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Rule over. Have dominion over animals. This is language that a lot of people are very uncomfortable with in our society. You might hear people say, animals and humans are equal. We should treat animals as we would treat humans. And I think in some ways this is a corrective. We tend to swing one way or the other. I think this is the corrective to the abuse that we have done. When people look at the world, like, have we brought Eden to this world? Not really. We have brought a lot of cruelty and a lot of disregard for creation. And unfortunately, Christians or people using the Bible have used passages like this and said, well, it says, God says we can do whatever we want. We have dominion. We rule. The world is ours to trash and abuse and take what we want, and it doesn't matter anyway. That's what God has given us. I think that is a misreading of the text. And I think when we have done that, I think there's a place for Christians to repent and say, okay, maybe we got it wrong. That's maybe not what God is saying in this passage. Christians should be at the forefront of environmental and animal welfare issues, because when it says we are to have dominion, it's always under the dominion of God. We are God's representatives. Especially as Christians, we recognize that we are not the rulers ultimately of this world. We worship the King of Kings, Yahweh. And so we want to be thinking about, okay, well, how does God rule? How does he rule? We see he has this deep love for his creation. We see him sustaining his world. We see him using his creativity to see life flourish. That's how we should be having dominion. And if you want a concrete example, I saw this on the news the other night. There's this night parrot in Queensland that they thought was extinct, and 2 years ago they sighted it. And the last sighting was 70 years ago, so people got really excited about this. And now there is this secret, because they don't want poachers to find it, because they will want to, kill the little birds and sell it. But so there's this secret conservation heritage area where they're trying to let the birds grow, population flourish. I think that is what it looks like to have dominion. And actually it's pretty amazing, because no other animal species thinks about how all the other animal species are going. That's one of our roles as humans, is to think about how can we care for other species and help them to see them flourish. And when you hear stories like that, those scientists, I don't know whether they have faith or not, but whether they believe in God or not, they are living out God's purposes. They're living out what it means to be human. And I think one of the things that Christians can bring, and we don't always do this, is celebrating and acknowledging people, whether they believe in God or not, who are living out God's purposes and saying, you are living out what it means to be human. And we want to celebrate that. We want to affirm that. And sometimes we might want to join in. Christians sometimes have a bad habit of just separating and doing our own separate thing, which can be good sometimes, but sometimes it's just as powerful to join in with what is already happening and rejoice in that. To be human is to care about the world, others, and God. The New Testament speaks about a time coming when Jesus Christ will be appointed judge, and he'll be judging us on how human we have been. How have we cared for the world? How have we treated others? How we have treated God? Now, I find that a scary thought, because I probably haven't done very well in either of those areas. But the good news that Christians cling to is that not only is Jesus the judge, but he is our defender and the one who's willing to take our place for any punishment that we might deserve. That is what the cross is all about, that at the cross Jesus laid down his life so that we might be forgiven. And not only that once we've been forgiven, the Holy Spirit comes to begin transforming us so that we might be more human. Why? Because when we die, we're not going to heaven so we can just, sit around playing harp music constantly to one another, looking at one another across the clouds. That's not the Christian picture. When we die, we are told that we'll be resurrected so that we might be fully human, living in a new heaven and a new earth. In Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." In the end, we see that a lot has changed since Genesis 1. We're not going back to the garden. We're not starting over again. We see a garden city. So there's some good things that have happened in our world. There's some things that we have subdued world, that we have allowed to flourish. And in some sense, that's going to be incorporated into the city. We have this picture of the nations and the rulers bringing the best of their culture into this city, and then God redeeming and purifying and resurrecting it so that it is fully good. The picture in the end is of people being what they've always designed to be, living human lives representing God in this world. And in some sense, and of course it's not 100% clear because we probably can't get our minds wrapped around it, but in some sense there's this picture of us ruling with Christ. We've still got work to do, even though if you're thinking, I can't wait to get to heaven because then I'm just going to rest and do nothing all day. Sorry to disappoint you. There'll still be work, but it'll be good work as we rule with Christ, seeing this new world flourish. So when we think about our work, when we think about our studies, and we think about our lives now, it all has to sit in under that bigger question. If this is our purpose, if this is what God has designed for us to be, if this is what's really important, seeing relationships flourish, seeing this world flourish, seeing animals flourish, then how does my work, how does my life fit into that now? And we're going to spend some time actually now for you to think about that, to pray about that, and to respond. And I don't know where you are with God, because if you don't know God, then that's a good place to start by responding and thinking, I don't even have a relationship with God yet, and I need to start by getting back into a relationship with God. Is that possible? Yes, because Jesus has this beautiful picture of saying, if you want to know God, He's waiting there with open arms. Come back to Him, be reconciled with Him, come back into the relationship. That is why you are made. Maybe we need to start in a place of confession and repentance. Maybe we need to think through, I haven't really thought that much about the environment. Don't really like animals that much. That's me sometimes. I have relationships that really need to be dealt with or that's broken. Maybe I need to spend some time talking about that with God. Maybe I'm so busy with my tasks, my study, whatever, that I don't have time to give to people. Maybe I need to ask God to help change that in me. Maybe you need to ask God, okay, God, well, those purposes sound great, but I have no idea where I fit in. I mean, they're so big. What part can I play? Maybe we need to ask God that. Or maybe you're like, I know what my calling is. I know how I fit into this. And maybe it's just writing that down. How does your work right now, or your study right now, see this world flourishing?